Welcome to episode 12 of the Strategic Momentum Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Steele. In every episode, we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders and how they've been able to break through their business inertia and propel their business forward. Back in episode 9, Dr. Lamia, a psychologist and author who has spent her career encouraging emotional awareness in adults, adolescents, and preteens, shared with us the importance of understanding our own emotions as well as others. Because when we understand them, whether they're positive or negative, they can be used as motivators. Today, Dr. Lamia digs into the specific motivational styles of successful people. She discusses the value in understanding your own natural style of getting things done and how people with different motivational styles can better work with each other to build and maintain strategic momentum in a business environment. I feel that the notion of having similar styles is at times more valued than the differences.
The world would be a very boring place if we were all the same, and, things wouldn't happen. I mean, there are some people who are better all year round as cave people, picking nuts and berries, and other people were better at standing at the cave entrance and waiting for a saber-toothed tiger to come along to kill them. So, I mean, it's just, we have different strengths and weaknesses. And if we really are an accumulation of all of our emotional memories throughout our lives that makes us who we become, there are differences, and those differences can be used, but we have to understand the emotions that created them. I don't think that's emphasized much at all. And actually, that's another reason why I wrote the book that I did recently, is because in terms of the motivation to get things done, there are absolute differences between people who are deadline driven and people who do things ahead of time. And neither style is better than the other, but people think one style is better than the other style. And if individuals understand that there are different motivational styles and people do things differently, then they could work together very, very effectively. Otherwise, they'll just be annoyed with one another.
These two styles of highly successful people, one that is task-driven, which I have realized after reading your book, I am more in that camp, and the deadline-driven, or the tend to be more procrastinators. That is my husband. So it was very enlightening to me because it helped me understand why he behaves in the way that he does. But it's not until I got that perspective that it made me think differently.
Rather than shame or criticize him for his way of doing things in a deadline. What I found in my studies was that the divergent ways in which high-achieving people are motivated to complete tasks is based on when their emotions are activated and what activates them. So procrastinators who consistently complete tasks on time, even if it's at the last moment, are motivated by emotions that are activated when a deadline's imminent. They're deadline driven. And in contrast, task-driven non-procrastinators, when they are faced with uncompleted tasks, feel compelled to take action right away. So as soon as they see something that has to be done, their emotion is activated by that task. The task is a stimulus that activates their emotion, and they have to do it to relieve themselves of the effects they feel. So they're motivated to do things constantly. Procrastinators who are deadline-driven don't understand that. They're not activated by tasks. They're activated primarily by deadlines. So is one better than the other? Not necessarily. It's just different based on emotional memories from childhood. What I saw on people is that these motivational styles started in elementary school in terms of how they did their homework or when they did their homework. Some people were quite happy to come home from school and go out and play and do their homework at the last minute, while others had to get it done because they couldn't stand the feeling it caused and then go out and play. So it's just differences, but understanding these different motivational styles is very, very important in the workplace. And you know what? What constitutes success? It boiled down to two things with the high achievers I studied, no matter how you define success, which is they never, ever miss a deadline. Even if they were the most severe procrastinators, they never missed a deadline. And their work always reflected their best efforts. So if they were task-driven, they didn't just do something to get it off their plate. They always put their best effort into the task.
So for those who are task-driven, like myself, or skew more task-driven, is it then seeing these ongoing data points of the deadline-driven styles and seeing the continual delivery of the projects where somebody like me would then be able to feel more comfortable with that? Because as us task-driven people are, we expect certain things to be done in a specific time frame. And when they aren't, it creates anxiety for us and worry. So is the only way to some degree to mitigate that concern that the other person's going to do their job is just to somewhat have faith and see that there's a pattern of continual delivery?
Does this person ever miss a deadline? And does their work reflect their best efforts? If that's the criteria, it doesn't matter when you do it, as long as it's done before the deadline. Now you may say, well, what if there is not an absolute deadline? Well, procrastinators have all kinds of ways to create absolute deadlines when there are none. And the highly successful people I studied were amazing in their ability to create absolute deadlines. And I talk about that in the book. I also wrote a Psychology Today blog post on it recently, how procrastinators create deadlines when there are none, essentially. And so, if you use that criteria, then it doesn't matter if you do it ahead of time. There was a study where they had people, adults, line up, and there was a goal line, and their task was to pick up a bucket of pennies before they crossed the goal line. And it didn't matter how soon they did it, but, they were baffled by the fact that so many of them picked up that bucket of pennies right away, even though it was heavy, and others picked them up just before they got to the goal line. And so they inquired, and the people who picked them up early just kind of wanted to get that task off their plate. They just wanted to do it so they didn't have to think about it. People who are task-driven have a fear of forgetting or a fear of some impending disaster or something happening, even if it's little, that will interfere with them getting something done. That's the cognition associated with the anxiety they feel when a task is left uncompleted. So they're willing to carry that bucket of pennies farther just to get it done. Now, is getting something done ahead of time better than getting it done at the deadline? No. Though, you know what? We've got Benjamin Franklin telling us that the early bird gets the worm. It's not true. The futurist Paul Sappho says sometimes it's the second mouse who gets the cheese.
Do you feel that individuals can shift styles potentially?
Sure. I mean, people adapt and they change, and they can be very flexible with it. My point in the book is that you have to take a look at where you function optimally. It's important to take a look at where you do it best. I interviewed a number of deadline-driven people who tried to do things ahead of time. Many of them had a very hard time unless they used one of their tricks to create an absolute deadline, because they didn't feel any emotion. They didn't have any fuel or motivation or any octane to do it. I've also talked to task-driven people who drive themselves crazy, revising a document, whereas deadline-driven people will do it in one draft at a deadline. They have amazing memory for details and can spit it all out at once. And these task-driven people tried to wait until the deadline to do something so they would stop obsessing about it. And it made them really crazy because they weren't effective at a deadline and they needed the time to revise. So it's a matter of experimenting and of course life circumstances like the workplace you're in or whatever else you're doing, the amount of time that you have. If you have very, very limited time, you might become more deadline driven because you just have to be. So, there's a lot of situations where I can only say it depends. But for the most part, people have a preferred style.
My key takeaway is really about understanding what works optimally for you and being in tune with that at the end of the day. And also fundamentally using the right criteria when you evaluate others in a work environment. And sometimes it's not about the how and the way they get it done, but really it ends up being, do they get it done? And have they done their best work? And it's the deliverable at the end of the day.
And it's most important between parents and children. Parents and children who have different motivational styles tend not to understand one another. If you're a procrastinator and your children are task-driven, you might not understand why they are compelled to do their homework when you have to drive them somewhere. And they just need to get this done before they go because they can't stand it not being done. Or if you're a task-driven parent and you have a procrastinating child and they're doing their homework at the last minute on their way to school, or they want to go out for construction paper at 9 p.m. and you're saying, well, you could have done the project 3 days ago and then we wouldn't be in this situation. That's not how they operate, but we do have to learn eventually to take into consideration the people around us and let them know how we work best so that they're not annoyed by our behavior. Task-driven people annoy procrastinators just as much as procrastinators annoy task-driven people, except procrastinators don't admit that as much because they have been so stigmatized and shamed about their motivational style and have been led to feel it's wrong that they don't lash out at task-driven people. When they do, they usually say, can't you sit down and rest? Do you have to do that now? Can't you do that later?
What's the urgency?
What's the urgency?
Yes.
The urgency is your emotion is telling you to do it. But task-driven people can learn often to put aside that urgency a little bit and really reflect on it. And that's where being aware of what you feel is important and accepting what you feel and saying, is it really that important to do this now? Or can I sit down with my family and watch a movie?
I'd like to thank Dr. Lamia again for sharing thoughts from her book with us. You can learn more about emotions and how they motivate you in her book, What Motivates Getting Things Done. And be on the lookout for her next book, The Upside of Shame, which is coming out on February 6th, 2018. And remember, it's important that we understand the absolute differences between people who are deadline-driven and people who are task-driven. These successful styles, well, neither one is better than the other. It's only when we're able to understand our own motivational style and the emotions that drive us that we're able to then work more effectively with others who have different styles. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can learn more about Dr. Lamia and connect with her at marylamia.com. That's MaryLamia.com. If you want to hear previous episodes or even get show notes from this episode, visit us on our podcast page at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.